Yeah, it's because she's sharing the screen because it's supposed to be the camera on you.
Okay.
You want to try stop sharing or
I try.
it should work again, right?
Where is it? Wait. No. No,
Maybe if you go back to Zoom.
yeah, I should be able to.
Got it. Yeah.
We try.
And now we have this one. That's why. Obviously. Okay, now I'm doing the spotlight on you.
It's working now.
Almost there. Almost there.
Hello, you are muted in the room.
Oh, sorry, I don't touch anything.
My bad,
Okay.
I'm so sorry for that.
No worries. So do you want me to start again?
Unfortunately.
Okay, that's okay. A redo. I get a redo, it's good. So you can hear me now?
Yes,
Okay.
perfectly.
Perfect. So good afternoon and buenas tardes because we're here in Mexico. It is my great pleasure today to introduce the panel on media and politics. We have two speakers. The order has been inverted for technological reasons. The first speaker is Francisca Frici, and her paper, I'll introduce her first. She studied history at the Humboldt University and Germanistik and comparative literatures at the Technische Universität Berlin. And now she's about to finish her PhD at the Universidad de Navarra in Pamplona, Spain, under the supervision of Jaume Aurel and Kalle Pihlainen. Our second speaker is Ilan Ehrlich. He is an associate professor of history at Bergen Community College. His first book, Eduardo Chivas, The Incorrigible Man of Cuban Politics, was published in 2015, and he's currently at work on a political biography of former Cuban President Ramon Grau San Martin. Great, take it away.
So I try to share my screen and hopefully it works because it didn't work before. We hope.
It's loading, right?
Yeah, it seems to load, yeah. Hopefully it works. Technik, die begeistert. As we say in German. Okay, it looks like I have to do it again. It happened before. I'm very sorry that for some reason my device sometimes shares and sometimes it does not. Okay, we try it one more time. Okay. We should not have done that. It worked like literally 5 minutes ago. It did work, and
Did it just pop up randomly before?
No.
No, I mean when it worked, did you do anything different or
No.
It just
It's
suddenly
just basically you click one button and then
and
start.
it worked immediately. That's loading.
Okay, it's loading. I would just suggest that I just get started, and we hope at some point that it will pop up. If not, I have the quotes that I'm sharing quotes, so I'm having them in my presentation. I'm sorry for this, but the technique is really not something that I'm a fan of. Okay, super. Thank you very much. I would like to thank actually the organizers, Bernage and Lisette Jacinto and Luis Trindade. They made an amazing job. I'm very fascinated with how everything clicks in and functions. Thank you very much for being here, and so I'm going to get started. The following presentation is in principle trying to get a theoretical grip on the interrelationship between social media, historiography, and history production. As I am originally coming from Germany, I am of course interested in German history. Thus, my presentation or the debate that I am presenting today originates in Germany, and its participants are mostly German historians. However, beside the fact that international news outlets like the New York Times and CNN have reported on the so-called Hohenzollern debate, which confirms its international prominence, this very debate I'm presenting today is, as I think, of fundamental interest for both philosophy/theory of history and historiography in general, as the so-called Hohenzollern debate contains historical, historiographical, and representational problems that once and in the past held the potential to engulf theorists and philosophers of history and historians since Hayden White's Metahistory was published in 1973 up until today. For background information, or to shortly answer the question what the Hohenzollern debate actually is about, on September 27th, in 1994, after German reunification, the German parliament passed a measure permitting compensation for the loss of property confiscated by the Allies, including the communists, between 1945 and 1949, though only on the condition that the claimants or their ancestors had not given substantial erheblichen Vorschub leisten in German legalese to the National Socialist or East German communist regimes. Since this law has passed, the Hohenzollern have engaged in having the once confiscated property returned. As this law requires professional knowledge of the specific past of the Hohenzollern family, historians are the main experts and authorities in regards to questions about this very past, and as they are considered established and institutionalized experts on historical factuality, true to form, the actions of the Hohenzollern have made historians the main protagonists and authorities in the Hohenzollern case and debate. It is the historians who give answer to the question whether the Hohenzollern had substantially supported National Socialism to seize power. Who are the Hohenzollern? From the status of great elector, then to kings, and finally to emperors, the Hohenzollern dynasty provided the most visible backbone to the constitution of the Prussian and then the unified German state for over 4 centuries. They provided many of history's lead dates, the great 18th and 19th century battles against Austria, against Napoleon, against France, and furnished much of the country's artistic and architectural landscape. Sans Souci, the Garnison Church, for example. The central question is, how is the legacy of this old Germany intertwined with the rise of the new German Third Reich? What do we see when we see a Hohenzollern today? This is not my question, but it lies at the heart of the debate about the deposed Hohenzollern and the rising Nazis in 1933. My question is to examine the authority historians invest in themselves as they animate this hot present-day debate. Between 2011 and 2026 historical expert reports have been written. 5 of those historical reports were commissioned by political and governmental authorities, and one, namely that one written by Christopher Clark, was privately commissioned by the lawyers of the Hohenzollern. In the first place, Clark's export report was pro-Hohenzollern, which is to say that Clark originally came to the result that the Hohenzollern did not substantially help the Nazis to seize power. But in the course of the discourse events, or as the debate aroused more and more public attention, so to speak, Clark changed his mind. In this regard, it is not unimportant to mention that even professional authorities like Sir Richard Evans stepped into the debate with several articles against the Hohenzollern and criticizing Christopher Clark. I.E. Evans pronounced his belief that the Hohenzollern in fact did substantially help the Nazis to seize power and therefore should not be given any legal ground to rewrite or restore the history and get back the property they once owned. The historians Stefan Malinowski, Peter Brandt, Wolfram Püter, Benjamin Hasselhorn, and Stefanie Middendorf have each been commissioned by political and governmental authorities to each render their expert opinion. As it stands, Malinowski, Brandt, Middendorf, and Clark, after he had changed his mind, clearly contend that the Hohenzollern in fact did substantially help the National Socialism to seize power. And as it also stands, only the historians Benjamin Hasselhorn and Wolfram Püter have been more hesitant or reluctant or refrained from clearly attesting the Hohenzollerns' past to have substantially contributed to the rise of the Nazis. Expert reports that attest to the Hohenzollern to bear substantial joint responsibility for the rise of the Nazis would prevent the Hohenzollern from getting back their once owned property by law and in court. It weakens, of course, also the Hohenzollerns' negotiation position with the government in principle. This might explain why the Hohenzollern, since the expert reports were written and published, have aggressively taken actions against historians, journalists, and politicians in order to control and contain the way their past has been presented, narrated, curated, or talked about in and by the public. The Hohenzollern have started to massively bombard politicians, historians, and journalists with injunction suits. Those injunction suits have been successful in many cases, and the main commissioned expert, namely the historian Stefan Malinowski, had probably suffered the most. The injunction suits against historians became such a big problem that the Verband der Historiker und Historikerinnen Deutschlands, at the time chaired by the historian Eva Schlothäuber, got involved in order to protect the historiographical discipline, its representatives or individual authorities, their academic freedom, their freedom of speech, the discipline's procedures and methodology, and of course the expert opinions historians have arrived at. One could say that the German Historikerverband entered the debate in order to defend the historiographical authority as such. However, the German Historikerverband decisively took the side of those historians who attested the Hohenzollern as substantial joint responsibility for the rise of National Socialism. The public defense of the German Historikerverband concentrated on criticizing the Hohenzollerns' contemporary actions and therefore confined itself to those historians and journalists who concluded that the Hohenzollern did substantially help the Nazis to seize power. As historians are divided concerning the past of the Hohenzollern and have, as I will show, started to attack and denunciate their colleague historians who came to a different conclusion concerning the Hohenzollerns' past, the German Historikerverband remained inconsequent, or what one today would call biased. The Verband took a clear political side. Given I have only 20 minutes and I'm concentrating on discourse wandering to Twitter, I refrain from going into further details here as there is a lot of material published. However, the injunctions against historians, journalists, and politicians can quite unproblematically be identified as a variant of so-called SLAPS, which is SLAPS means strategic lawsuit against public participation. Understandably and justifiably, the Hohenzollerns' apparent proclivity for injunctions have caused large outrage among even prominent historians and its official authoritative organs to the benefit of the expert reports that have attested to Hohenzollern that the study of their past reveals that they in fact did substantially help National Socialism to seize power. Also, understandably, the public attention and the publicity of the debate attracted many historians who commented on the case in conventional genres like monographs, edited volumes, and a variety of newspaper articles. In the eyes of the historians, the Hohenzollern debate turned into a debate about the integrity of truth as such, as the Hohenzollerns' injunctions against historians and their general attempt to gain back their property has been identified by a majority of historians, journalists, and politicians as being an attempt to influence, control, and even change the view on the Hohenzollerns' past as having helped the Nazis to come to power. Although I myself understandably largely question the ethics of the Hohenzollern, I disagree to the simplification of the Hohenzollern debate insofar as the way the historians debate about the debate itself rather undermines than confirms their authority as experts for the following principal reasons. First, there is no theoretical reflection on the discourse of this debate. Or, in other words, there is no reflection on discourse rules or mechanisms that lie outside the control of this debate's participants, i.e. the Hohenzollern themselves and those that and the historians, journalists, politicians, and judges involved. The debate is actually pretty crowded, I would say. Nonetheless, theorists or philosophers are not central to the debate, at least not to my knowledge. Second, the argumentation for and against the Hohenzollerns' substantial joint responsibility for the Nazis' rise mainly proceeds on a pure positivist factual level. And if theoretical or philosophical arguments are pronounced, like in the case of Stefan Malinowski's latest book publication, Malinowski published in October 2021 the book Die Hohenzollern und die Nazis, Geschichte einer Kollaboration, the abstractions on the Hohenzollerns' past do well without professional, contemporary, philosophical, or theoretical expertise. In January 2022, the historian Lothar Machtan, who himself published a book on the issue right before Malinowski, which also stands in competition to it, comes to the result that Malinowski's theoretical excursions to, for example, Kantorowicz, Weber, Sartre, Bourdieu, would be scientifically pretentious in the sense of simulating scientific know-how by referring to those thinkers. Furthermore, Machtan largely questions Malinowski's moral pointing finger that takes the reader up on Malinowski's promise and premise. Lothar Machtan has been himself massively criticized, not least because he had received payments by the Hohenzollern while working on his own book. The historian Peter Schöttler, for example, ended his friendship to Machtan in a tweet, therefore. So Lothar Machtan's argumentation needs to be equally taken with a pinch of salt. However, Machtan's review of Malinowski's work reveals that Malinowski's theoretical considerations allow historians like Machtan, yet again, to discredit theory and philosophy of history in a manner that throws us directly back to the reception history of Hayden White that we have seen in the 1990s, for example, the critique of Sir Richard Evans himself and his defense of history, or Keith Winchottle. In this sense, I'd rather not have a historian do theory and philosophy in apparently flawed, but surely questionable and argumentatively vulnerable ways, let alone would I want to see theoretical considerations arrive at a moral conclusion, as this would both be scientifically unethical and argumentatively insufficient. This is not to say that Malinowski is unable to think theoretically. No, I would never say that. But it is to say that his reflections on the theoretical body of thought do not follow and actually ignore contemporary professional discussions discussions on it that, for example, take place right now here. In other words, Malinowski parallels philosophy and theory of history, and in so doing, disqualifies theoretical or philosophical know-how or value for history, historiography, and historians that we have arrived at in our days. One could say that Malinowski actually pretends that Hayden White's contestation with narrative did never substantially, to make use of the word here, and justifiably could challenge conventional historiography. In this sense, Malinowski does in fact not, quote Hayden White in Tropics of Discourse, admit that all histories are in some sense interpretations, quote end, and he does not, another quote, Hayden White, determine the extent to which historians' explanations of past events can qualify as objective accounts of reality, quote end. Hence, Malinowski takes up a theoretical authority that he is neither professionally nor argumentatively able to stabilize or defend against the most simple critic. Hence, theory and philosophy gets authoritatively and not argumentatively discredited. One could say that Malinowski accidentally confirms and contributes to a philosophy of historiography in a way that deletes philosophers and theorists of history from the sample. The main problem of the Hohenzollern debate is, of course, of theoretical nature. The theoretical know-how gets replaced by highly politically and ideologically charged narratives that, instead of monitoring their validity, rather reconfirm their self-righteousness. The fact that the participants of the debate battle over factual control instead of acknowledging and dealing with its discursive characteristics and mechanisms, and the unavoidability or the inability to control certain aspects of such changes, I see explicitly confirmed in the ways the narrative and language change simultaneously with the genre they are expressed in and are made sound in. This gets especially clear looking on what happens to the professional historiographical protocols that also the German Historikerverband wishes to be understood, acknowledged, respected, put into practice, and be left alone. The historiographical expertise on its way from book to Twitter experiences a drastic change. The historian Hedwig Richter, who is very present in German media in general, she's very famous, contends on Twitter, for example. Now my Zoom doesn't work, I just read it. We lose time. This Hohenzollern riffraff, bloodthirstiness and anti-Semitism, and this missing sense of decency, Dorn. In addition to it, Malinowski's book is written so good. Quote end. One can interpret many aspects of a tweet, starting with the paratextual components of tweets, and I've only gotten started. What I would point out now is, though, that she uses the present tense in this tweet, which is to say that it is not clear whether the allegations or accusations she pronounces apply to the contemporary descendants of the Hohenzollern dynasty or the protagonists of the dynasty's past. In both cases, the social media public of such comments entail discursive amplifications and ramifications for that the historiographical authority cannot act as guarantor in a professional as well as ethical sense. Another example of blunt denunciation would be come from Patrick Barnes, on the who's the former chief editor of the feuilleton of the FAZ. Barnes writes, it's a little complicated because I had to translate it. It doesn't actually make much sense, but you will understand. Important context to the ongoing research on the Hohenzollern apologist Hasselhorn, the doubts that Eva Schlothäuber and Eckhard Konze raised about Hohenzollern's status as an expert provided the right-wing opposition in VHD tweets opportunity to mobilize. So he accuses him of This tweet shows a direct political denunciation of the historical expert Benjamin Hasselhorn, commissioned by the political party CDU. Hasselhorn arrives at a less clear conclusion on the Hohenzollerns' past in comparison to Malinowski or Brandt insofar as he pointed out that the existing research on the Hohenzollerns past would be still missing in order to pronounce a solid conclusion to the problem the Hohenzollerns claim for compensation poses. Social media companies like Facebook and Twitter, as we all know, have become an essential part of everybody's day-to-day life and are surely here to stay. The academic world has long accepted social media's impact on the world in a variety of forms and meanwhile operates on it as the rest of the world does. Twitter threads or tweets are generally accessible to an, as I would say, undefined or unlimited public as default, which might be one reason why politicians, intellectuals, and journalists, or academics for that matter, have started to integrate and make use of Twitter in various ways. The transparency that social media offers to its participants defines one of this new media's characteristics. It, for example, gave Ilkka Lehtenmäki in his article, The Finnish Twitter War, the Winter War Experienced through the #Soda39 project and its implications for historiography, published in 2016, occasion to theorize about social media's meaning, qualities and advantages in regard to a more democratic participation in history, i.e. its ways of producing history, presence, and realities which go beyond the scope of conventional or authoritative history production that is usually done by professional historians. In our days, historians make themselves largely use of social media, either for sharing their publications and opinions with their peer group and the public, or for what I would say advertise their expertise and establish or reconfirm their professional authority as experts of the past, where past means everything until the very second that has just passed by right now. On social media, we can observe that the rigid and conventional and disciplinary boundaries within historiography and between historians are about to disappear, as specialized historians tend to make their opinions sound on events that lie outside their specialization and expertise, and in some cases, they do so on an hourly basis. Even though, however, historians understand how social media works, my impression is that most historians who make use of social media do not discuss the phenomenon of social media with the necessary know-how or criticism, or they do not take the distance one would wish or hope for as for example, Lehtenmäki did. For example, not only once have I seen historians celebrating the growing number of their so-called followers on their social media profiles. I spare myself to give a source here. Suffice it to say that such celebrations of social media followers rather confirm than question the terms and conditions or rules of social media companies. The amplification of information on a social media platform proceeds under quantitative terms that are defined by the respective media company, like how often something clicked on, shared, retweeted, etc. It is not the quality of the content of a tweet or a thread that determines its amplification in the first place. We all have heard or read somewhere that content moderation poses a tremendous problem for social media companies. Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, but Twitter's launch of Spaces made way for the Taliban to flock on it, just to give an example. Twitter has so far been unable to deal with this. Looking at Trump and other politicians whose accounts have been suspended by Twitter, one could say that the First Amendment of the US Constitution does not protect you from Twitter, but it protects Twitter from you, which brings me to my next point. The current most popular social media platforms are companies with their headquarters located in the United States of America. This is to say that their terms and conditions primarily orient themselves on the legislation of that very country. The most influential social media platforms are located in the United States. One could say that the last or highest authority in the Hohenzollern debate, in a way, is not the historian, but it is actually Twitter, as Twitter amplifies, manages, and legally owns the information or the discourse that it hosts. The use of social media and its meaning, its ramification, or its repercussions are precisely not taken into critical account by the celebration of followers in an appropriate critical way.
We're
Okay.
time, so if you could begin to wrap up, that'd be great.
Okay. As Ilka Lehtenmäki theoretical analysis of the meaning of social media for history and its production concentrates on social media's or Twitter's historical and or even democratic potential, such celebrations stand in sharp contrast to such theoretical considerations. This contrast is also reflected in the way historians discuss social media when they are not directly engaged in the history of digitalization or the history of the digital era. That being said, what I, for example, take out of Lechtenmachi's, as I think, excellent article, is that given the discursive and societal powers that have been attributed to social media like Facebook and Twitter multiple times, it is highly questionable, for example, that discourses that are taking place on social media, like Facebook and Twitter, would stay under the radar of a general public, as, for example, the German historian Thomas Sandkühler claims in a comment published in Public History Weekly. This cannot even be solidly claimed for Facebook bubbles or threads, even though Facebook threads are not necessarily public as default. On a pure technical level, the privacy settings that Facebook equips its users with do not allow precise control and curation over the information flow, let alone obliging the specific audience of a thread that is itself always defined and never not defined to discretion. To come back to Twitter, Twitter's search function does not differentiate between thematic or disciplinary bubbles. It does not categorize, identify, or specifically mark communities. On the contrary, Twitter's search function puts emphasis on words and individuals and individual accounts. Specific discourses of a specific community that happen on social media do also not arrive at an alternative public, as, for example, the historians Claudia Gatzka and Sonja Dolinczak have claimed also on Public History Weekly. Given the fact that experts from different fields have, for example, long described social media's manipulative impact on societies and history, for example, the presidential election of Donald Trump or conspiracy theories in regards to COVID, it is invalid to pronounce such a claim for already the very simple reason that political, historical, societal, and psychological effects of social media only can be addressed as being problematic when discourses on social media are actually reaching a general public. Hedwig Richter, for example, has at the moment 27,000 followers, and Patrick Bahn has almost 29. It doesn't sound very much to me that this is an alternative public or a bubble. It is common to use, it doesn't sound, This very claim can already be questioned on a pure technical level.
Francisca, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but in the interest of time, can you take the next minute to conclude the paper?
Yes. Okay. I'm sorry I'm just.
We also started a little bit late, and we just want to make sure that we have time for discussion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I will just stop here, and I will just read this. Okay. I've just come to my general conclusions. The ways in which historians not only randomly but systematically make use of Twitter can be interpreted as an actual form of censorship. This censorship is directed at both colleagues disagreed on and the public that it engages. One could even go as far as pronouncing the argument that social media and Twitter offers new opportunities for historians and historiography to underpin their authority and even install what the historian Anton Debates defines as self-censorship, as Twitter functions as a megaphone whereby its algorithms and machine learning decide over the importance of a statement or tweet, whereby ghost banning would be its clear negative. However, the establishment of such censorships is precisely what the Hohenzollern have been largely criticized for in the public debate. This is in my eyes, professionally and argumentatively contradictory and insincere. And from my theoretical point of view, historians have long forfeited and lost the license to proceed with such a lack of self-criticism. Historians' reflections and actions on Twitter or social media, as I would say, are as banal as the arguments in the Hohenzollern debate have stayed positivist.
Thank you so much, Francisca, for the very rich paper. Now we have Ilan's paper, it's entitled "The Most Listened to Station in the Republic." Oh, sorry. I apologize for that.
No, it's fine.
It's just the technology, so I have this in my mind, making sure everything is audible. So the paper is entitled "The Most Listened to Station in the Republic: How the Auténtico Party's Mastery of New Media Built a Cuban Political Powerhouse, 1937-1938." Take it away, Ilan.
Hi, thank you so much. Sorry, I'm only, I have to, I'm a little bit pressed for time. So, I'll probably, I'm kind of concise by nature, but I want to give people a little bit of time to discuss. And I understand this is going to be, we only have 15 minutes left. So I want to keep mine really brief. I really want to talk about some reasons. And really what's interesting to me is this idea in the early 1930s. I'm kind of going way back in history, but way back in the early 1930s of the attempt to create a new political party based on a fairly old idea in Cuba in 1934. So in 1892, you had this political party started by the Cuban independence hero, Jose Marti, called the Partido Revolucionario. The main thing in this party was to try to establish in Cuba a political party that was democratic from the ground up, which is to say not only the top leadership, but all local officials, all mid-level officials would all be democratically elected. In 1902, so this political party peters out at the end of the Cuban Independence War, and then from 1902 to 1933, during the first 3 decades of the Cuban Republic, Cuban political parties internally are not very democratic at all. And so after the 1933 revolution in Cuba, there is very much this idea of what's known as, well, first of all, in February of 1934, you have the founding of a party called the Auténtico Party, but it's really just a new version of the Partido Revolucionario Cubano, or the PRC. And really what they try to do is they try to test Marti's idea if a completely democratic party is possible in Cuba, which is to say a party where local officials, from the very lowest level, from the neighborhood level, all the way up to the top, are elected democratically. And so this is kind of this very big experiment in Cuba. And it's really the only time in Cuban history. The interesting thing is, in Cuban history, all, including today's leadership, everybody looks to Jose Marti as kind of this nationalist independence hero. But what's happening in the 1930s is really the only attempt ever in Cuban history, and I found this in the archives, to really try to put Marti's ideas into effect. And so in the mid-1930s, there's a genuine attempt to really do this. In addition, they're doing this in an atmosphere where the party is only semi-legal. Many political parties are harassed in Cuba in the mid-1930s. This is a period where Cuba is not entirely democratic. Many political parties are not allowed to participate in national or local elections. It is run behind the scenes by a military man, Fulgencio Batista. And so what we see here is this attempt to organize this party. It is led by Ramon Grau San Martin, but it's also led by a lot of charismatic figures throughout the country. And what they try to really do is they try to take this idea to every part of the island and convince people that Marti's idea of a fully democratic party in every aspect is possible. And so one of the ways that they do this, which kind of brings me to how this relates to this conference, is using technology. So if we're talking about the mid-1930s, Cuba has a substantial literacy rate. And so really the best way to reach people is via the radio. Sometimes what also happens is in smaller towns, you did have many newspapers and you would have people, sometimes the radio would reproduce articles from the newspaper and things like that. So you have something going on in various levels, and you have a lot of technological innovation going on from the time for the time. So, for example, one of the things that they try to do is the Auténticos buy radio time or pool their resources to buy radio time on CMQ, which was the station that had the strongest signal, and they try to innovate because their leader, Ramon Grasa Martin, is in exile in Miami. So they try things like getting him to call in, which is very expensive. You know, this call from Miami to call in, and that he could kind of broadcast some of his views over the radio. But a lot of what's happening is this party is using a lot of local journalists, such as Guillermo Martinez Marquez, or Sergio Carbó, or Manuel Braña, or Eduardo Chivas, to really try to establish a radio presence, not only in the capital of Havana, but also in provincial towns like Matanzas or Las Villas or Santiago de Cuba or Camagüey. And so this is really what's happening. And, you know, I think the culmination of this, and what's kind of interesting, is so in 1937, the Auténtico Party actually broadcasts live its nominating convention, its National Assembly, where all the figures of the party are elected and put into place. And this is something that's completely unprecedented. So in many ways, you know, you have this very novel attempt. It's never really replicated ever again in Cuban history, at least in part because Ramon Grasa Martin runs for election in 1940 and loses for a number of reasons, which I don't have time to get into, mostly because of Cuban coalition politics. But I think this experiment of trying to set up a transparently democratic party in every respect, in every regard, that really tries to reach into the smallest parts of the island, tries to reach illiterate Cubans, tries to really involve large sections of the population. It really generates a lot of popular support. And even though Grau doesn't win the election, in many ways it is successful in planting a deep respect for Grau and many other of these figures who established a radio presence in Cuba. And so I think that is going to be a very influential part of Cuban politics going forward, this idea of using new technologies. So I'm happy to leave it there. I know, we only have 8 minutes left, which is not a lot of time. So I just really wanted to kind of bring up that, and that's really what I found based on my research in 2019 in the Archivo Nacional de Cuba in Havana. So thank you guys for listening, and thank you for your time, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Ilan, for that very rich paper. So we are opening the floor for questions. It has usually been done that the in-person participants and then the Zoom participants issue their questions, but maybe given in the interest of time and that Ilan, it seems like you have to leave at 1, we can just do it in a little bit more ad hoc fashion. So whoever has a question, please let us know. So maybe I'll take the prerogative of being chair if there are no questions, to ask Ilan about the use of the radio to transmit the ideas of José Martí, and if you could expand a little bit more on that, because you brought that up in the beginning, especially because of the ways in which this narrative of the fulfillment of Martí's promise were taken up later in the 1960s. So I was just curious to learn how the members of the Auténtico Party used Martí's rhetoric to advance their own kind of political agenda and the promises that they were making to people everywhere on the island.
Yeah, I think it's one of these big questions in Cuban politics. Certainly, first of all, I think it's important to keep in mind, especially for people who are not ultra familiar with Cuban politics, but Martí kind of means many things to many people. And for example, to the current regime, he really means anti-imperialism, and certainly Martí was an anti-imperialist. But Martí was really democratic to the core, and really felt that politics, it was very important to involve people in politics, for people to participate in politics, and for the widest possible participation in politics. And this isn't really something that the first 3 decades of the Republic is mostly legitimacy comes from participation in Cuba's independence war. And then once President Machado is deposed in 1933, you have kind of a new model, or the Auténticos tried this new model, and they really try to kind of go back to the original ideas of Martí. But I think one of the important things to remember is that, in politics, the main thing is to win, and not necessarily to, part of the reason they tried this strategy of Martí, or to try to go back to this original strategy of Martí, is they hoped and they thought that it might win. One of these unanswered questions about Ramón Grau San Martín, for example, is that, he seemed to be this ultra honest and straightforward guy. He was a guy who had his own money. He was a well-known physician. And there's this question of, why he kind of changed after 1940. And my, what I really kind of think is they tried this very open and honest and ultra democratic format, and it didn't really get the result that they wanted in 1940. So they started to alter their tactics a little bit, and really, in fact, started to look, the Auténticos, as you get further into the 1940s, start to really look at Mexico and the PRI for their inspiration, more than Martí in many regards. So hopefully that provides some form of an answer. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Ilan. Are there other questions?
Hello. Yes, oh, sorry. I was wondering, Ilan, thank you both for your presentations. I was wondering, Ilan, if you have analyzed or thought a little bit about comparisons between the uses of Martí in those times and the current uses of Martí, particularly considering the fact that Cuba has one of the highest literacy rates right now. So I guess maybe there's been changes or maybe not. Have you had any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, no, listen, Martí is one of these things. Cubans are a notoriously argumentative lot. There's a saying in Cuba that Cubans can't agree on the color of white rice. And so, although I think any Latin American country has a version of that, we're argumentative people. And so, my mother's Cuban, by the way. So, but I think, it's one of these things, the current regime has really tried to link Martí to, during communist, when the regime was kind of more interested in communism, tried to sort of say that Martí really, even though he knew about communism and didn't really show any support for it, they tried to say that his ideas, that he was kind of a communist without really knowing that he was a communist, or he would have approved of this. There's a lot of attempts to kind of link, Martí to this kind of thought. And now, the current regime is more towards this idea of more of a nationalist and kind of anti-corruption campaign. And this is why some old figures like, for example, Eddie Chibas, who was very anti-communist, kind of was dropped, even though he was a political idol of Fidel Castro. he's kind of back in vogue now in Cuba because he was very nationalist and he was very much an anti-corruption campaigner. But yeah, I mean, Martí is kind of one of the one, you know, he means a lot of things to a lot of people, and he's kind of one of the one, he's really the one figure that all Cubans of all persuasions can really get behind. And even, you know, young Cubans now kind of say, well, when they're trying not to be divisive, they say like, well, can we just be all Jose Martí Cubans?
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you
Yes.
for your question, by the way.
I have a question for Irene. It's a very interesting course because and you did very interesting observations on that, which are quite unusual, I would say, because I mean I would say historians are thrilled that they are Austrian and that their work certainly has a resonance publicly, but also I mean they are called into court. But it's not them who will judge. It will be, in the end, it will be a judicial case. It will be a judge sitting, listening to the historians, their opinions, and then making a judgment. This is something which historians never do. You know, they still stick to the discourse, and it's not necessary to bring it to an end or so. In this case, it's different, and that's also nervous somehow, and don't know how to react, because suddenly it's not only academic discourse, which has a wide public resonance, it's really something, you know, for the Hohenzollern, it means, and for the state as well, it means quite some millions of euros, what their judgment depends on. And in the end, they are not making a judgment. But my question is, because your point was the whole debate is a battle from book to Twitter. And with Twitter, the whole debate changes and it has suddenly new influences. And this is very interesting. And you were also talking about Hedwig Richter. I mean, she's almost a flash mob sometimes when she experiences, but nobody has forced her to be so active on Twitter, which does not mean that, I mean, Twitter somehow follows different rules than academic discourse also.
Yes.
Everybody can first of all say what they want, and then maybe they are blocked or so, but in the first place it doesn't have the same rules. But to bring it back to the judicial case, I mean, the judges will not pick anyone as expert because they are active on Twitter, isn't it? I mean, how big, and now after a long speech myself, the question, how big is the impact of this Twitter debate seriously on the judicial course?
That is a very, very good question. And I'm actually very thankful for it because I believe, well, we read from someone like Professor Wersching that he believes that the judges in court cannot decide pro Hohenzollern, just more or less, that's what he said. And I believe he's wrong. I believe that historians actually do not hold that power anymore. And this is why I think this Twitter debate needs to be recognized, the discourse itself, its mechanisms needs to be recognized and acknowledged by historians, because they, as I said, they basically undermine their authority. And I believe in Germany, of course, there is, I mean, I think people like Hedwig Richter is probably influential to a public. I mean, that's the next question. How do you measure that? How do you measure, you know, but I do believe there is, I mean, she has a lot of, she's really very active in all sorts of venues. And she's also, it's even discussed by Elke Schmitter, I think, has written an article about what Hedwig Richter tweets, about her tweets, you know. So this is a good question, and I can't answer it. But I do not believe that the historians can answer it with their authority. And I believe some politicians have, interesting enough, actually they have given in a little bit to the historians who are really massively talking against the Hohenzollern's claims. because they also are dependent on the public in a different way. And this, see, here I cannot even myself make a very clear or a very sober analysis, because I actually want this to be analyzed. You know, as I said, I just got started. I think this needs to be, you need to get a grip on this, and you need to get to conceptualize this in a new way, so to speak. But thank you. That was a good question.
Since we started a little bit late because of technical reasons, perhaps we will just have time for maybe one more question. Is there another question on Zoom? Lisa? Lisa?
Yes, thank you so much, Francisca, for your amazing presentation. There's a lot of things to discuss about, and I was thinking, you know, the question of the authorities of the knowledge is maybe the very central problem of the history of philosophy, from Plato to Habermas. And every time I'm thinking about maybe is a part of our discourses. And I don't want to get to Twitter, and I think I'm very grateful for you, because we are discussing over time about two fronts. We have the other time, we have the other people who are doing history in social medias and so on, and then the historians or the guild of historians. And actually we are intertwined, and we are participating in constructing the system, actually. And so I totally agree with you, and I'm very thankful that you, when the point that we are responsible too for the creation of a social space. We are not on the ivory tower, not at all. And my point is, I was thinking, what could be an argument or a way not to defend the arguments of historians, but maybe, and not to defend the authorities, but maybe to make clear that historians are maybe trained to interpretate. They have expertises, or they have methodologies they learned. They use methods which is not the best, which is not perfect, but maybe is the best we have as human. So it's my question to you, it could be a solution for the guild, not to defend the guild as such, or historians, because they are historians, or the authorities in principle, but to say, of course they are interpretation, but we show you that that's maybe the better way we have to, or the conventional, the social way to think about a shared history, or to dispute a dispute, to discuss maybe the les règles du jeu, the rule of the play, so to say.
Yes, that is a very yes. I really want this to happen, because I believe the entire way this case is boxed in basically is completely unproductive. And that is a shame, because I always thought studying history is learning how to argue, and actually dare to argue. And not only that, but there's also, I mean, if you want to gain knowledge, then you need to have a dispute. And I believe, I mean, I wonder sometimes, what are these, don't they, like, what does it give you when you write a book with a moral conclusion and say this is how it needs to be, and you basically realize around you that people in fact do have come to a different result? I mean, what do you make? I mean, do you ignore this, or do you? Yeah, I wonder actually. And I mean, I don't understand this notion of the morality. And I think you can ethically think about it, but I don't even. To be honest, it's just my view. But I believe that
Malinowski actually does not differentiate between ethics and moral. And I think that differentiation is not only important or necessary, but fruitful and productive. And yeah, so, and there's so many interesting things in this whole Twitter and in this, I mean, there are these AI specialists who actually write books saying what AI will have made out of us in 40 years. And everything, it's already ML or algorithms. Twitter is AI based already. And I want a historian to go there, you know, and I want the historian to allow me as a theorist to join the debate and bring in new factors. So yes, exactly, I agree. I hope that answers the question.
Excellent. Well, join me in thanking the panelists and, of course, all of you for participating this afternoon.